Russia and China outmaneuvered the U.S. at the United Nations yesterday, getting their way on an immoral UN Security Council resolution on Gaza. There was no mention of October 7th, no condemnation of Hamas for its brutal initiation of this Israel-Hamas war, and no conditioning a ceasefire on the release of the hostages. Just an oversimplified demand for Israel to hand Hamas the victory during the month of Ramadan. Yet the U.S. abstained from voting on the Security Council's resolution, and its ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, responded by saying, quote, "This resolution rightly acknowledges that during the month of Ramadan, we must recommit to peace." End quote. Mind you, 1% of Americans are Muslim, but Ramadan has suddenly become oh so cherished by the Biden administration. Why? Because during this November's presidential election, he does not want to lose the Muslim vote in the state of Michigan, where there are a disproportionate amount of Muslim voters. I don't care how much you hate Donald Trump. There is no denying that the Biden administration is engaging in the slippery slope of populism by putting the desires of mostly anti-American, anti-democratic Muslim Americans ahead of others, notwithstanding Jewish Americans who have contributed so much to the U.S. over the decades. Hence, why everything is political and cynical. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, reacted to the U.S. not vetoing the Security Council's resolution, saying, quote, "Just a few days ago, the U.S. supported a Security Council resolution that linked a call for a ceasefire to the release of hostages. China and Russia vetoed that resolution partly because they opposed a ceasefire that was linked to the release of hostages. Yet today, Russia and China joined Algeria and others in supporting the new resolution precisely because it had no such linkage. Regrettably, the United States did not veto the new resolution, which calls for a ceasefire that is not contingent on the release of hostages. This constitutes a clear departure from the consistent U.S. position in the Security Council since the beginning of the war. Today's resolution gives Hamas hope that international pressure will force Israel to accept a ceasefire without the release of our hostages, thus harming both the war effort and the effort to release the hostages." End quote. 3 U.S. officials responded by saying that the White House sees this public rift with Israel over a UN Security Council resolution as a quote-unquote artificial crisis manufactured by Netanyahu for domestic political reasons. The reality is that this is an artificial crisis manufactured by the White House for domestic political reasons, since Biden's administration seems increasingly unwilling to honor the vast majority of Americans who believe Israel should defeat Hamas. Instead, it appears that Biden's team is using all available means, now the UN Security Council, to pressure Israel into halting short of destroying Hamas in Gaza so they can hang on to the Muslim voters in Michigan and their progressive friends throughout the country. Again, everything is political and cynical. It helps some of the Biden administration's un-American cause that the highest ever-ranking Jewish U.S. official, Senator Chuck Schumer, lambasted the current Israeli government in a speech 2 weeks ago on the floor of Congress. You know, the one in which he demanded that Israel should hold elections during an existential, multi-front war on at least 3 of its borders. While I am not a fan of the current Israeli government, did not vote for it, and will hope for an election after this war is over, I am also soberly aware that an election right now would be a disaster for Israel, since it would put the Jewish state in an even more vulnerable position. Plus, as one social media user quipped, quote, "Israel has had 9 elections since the last Palestinian parliamentary election in 2006. Senator Schumer thinks a 10th Israeli election is just what is needed to solve everything. Anyone who thinks Israelis would vote for a prime minister who campaigns on allowing a Palestinian state is too stupid to give any advice." End quote. We then discovered that Schumer is facing a challenge to his leadership from Chris Van Hollen, the junior Maryland senator who has established himself as a bitter critic of Israel and attracted wide support from progressives. Thus, Schumer was trying to convince progressives that he too can criticize Israel. Again, everything is political and cynical. California Governor Gavin Newsom published an open letter last week calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. He cited rising Islamophobia as one of the motivations behind his calculus. It turns out there are far more Jews than Muslims in California, and anti-Semitic incidents across the U.S. have increased at a ratio of 3-1 compared to Islamophobic ones. The first line of Newsom's letter said, quote, "California is a better place because of you, our Muslim, Palestinian American, and Arab American neighbors and friends who contribute so much to our state's sense of faith and belonging. California is a better place because of them. Really?" But then you realize that Newsom is a future Democratic presidential candidate who thus must make nice with America's tiny Muslim minority, especially those voters in the battleground state of Michigan and their progressive friends in other places. Again, everything is political and cynical. In Canada, the House of Commons decided last week to adopt an unprecedented and appalling pro-Hamas proposal that could assist the terror group in regaining power in Gaza and resuming terrorist activities, while empowering Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah. The motion, introduced by the New Democratic Party, calls on Canada to pressure Israel into agreeing to an immediate ceasefire in its war with Hamas. Members of the New Democratic Party were seen wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh, a headscarf, which is a symbol of radicalism. Also in Canada last week, an anti-Semitic cartoon published by a Canadian website made international news, a Jewish film festival was cancelled due to quote-unquote security concerns, the government moved to ban kosher meats, and Toronto police reported a 93% rise in anti-Semitic crime. What's going on in Canada? Demographics. The Muslim population, that is, the Muslim electorate, is growing, while the Jewish one is not. Never mind which group has been historically more productive and beneficial to Canadian society. Again, everything is political and cynical. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron now seems to be on the verge of making a grand gesture to Hamas by cutting off weapons supplies to Israel in the midst of war, as well as supporting an arms embargo across Europe. He justifies his threatened betrayal of one of Britain's most important allies by the demand that Israel should allow the International Red Cross access to captured Hamas terrorists, which he claims is required under international humanitarian law. He also said that Israel is deliberately and unnecessarily holding up humanitarian aid deliveries into Gaza, which is a patented lie. Plenty of aid has been entering the Strip. The problems are poor distribution methods by so-called human rights organization and Hamas terrorists seizing it. But sure, go ahead of blame the Jews. It would not be the first time that we are an easy, convenient scapegoat. Again, everything is political and cynical. Prominent English-language government spokesman Eileen Levy has been suspended from his post after complaints from the UK government, which reportedly raised concerns with Israel's foreign ministry after Levy responded to a March 8th post on X by the aforementioned UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron. The foreign minister wrote, quote, "People in Gaza are in desperate humanitarian need. We continue to urge Israel to allow more trucks into Gaza as the fastest way to get aid to those who need it." Levy responded to the post by saying that there were no problems with the capacity of aid trucks entering Gaza. Following his response, the British Foreign Office asked Israel's foreign ministry if the tweet, seen as attacking Cameron, was Israel's official position, which it is. Consequently, Levy was suspended, an episode which followed reports earlier in the year that the Israeli Prime Minister's wife, Sarah Netanyahu, was reportedly seeking to have Levy fired over past criticism of the premier, as well as over his participation in protests over the course of last year against the judicial overhaul legislation. Again, everything is political and cynical. Once upon a time, virtually every friend of Israel, including the United States, openly supported Israel's goal of defeating Hamas in Gaza following October 7th. More recently, all of these friends are aggressively proclaiming that Israel must not go into Rafah, the last Hamas stronghold that, if defeated by the IDF, would likely signal the end of the terror group's reign in Gaza, at least for the foreseeable future. So why are all of Israel's friends now so vehemently opposed to a major Israeli ground operation in Rafah? Is it because of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, or is there something perhaps a tad more political and cynical at play here? As one social media user observed, there has been a functional ceasefire with respect to Rafah for the last couple of months. What good has it yielded? Biden's Vice President Kamala Harris gave an interview this past weekend in which she said that she studied the maps and concluded that the civilians in Rafah have no place to go. It must have been an awfully small map, obviously left out Egypt and other Arab countries, commented David Friedman, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel. There are a few reasons why many of Israel's friends are now so vehemently opposed to a major Israeli ground operation in Rafah, as they cite Hamas's fraudulent civilian casualty numbers as proof of their justified opposition. One issue could be that, according to the UN, it is dangerous to evacuate civilians from Rafah because the rest of Gaza is littered with unexploded ordnance. In other words, Hamas booby-trapped tons of roads with explosives ahead of the IDF's advance, a strategy to pressure the West by putting Israel in impossible predicaments and weaponizing Palestinian deaths produced by Hamas. Another issue, according to Middle East security analyst Seth Frantzman, is that, quote, Hamas was obviously told from the beginning, maybe even before October 7th, that it would have protection from the West's closest ally in the region, Qatar, and that the ally would make sure that Israel would be prevented from going into parts of Gaza so that Hamas would get to recover and return to control Gaza. This whole war was stage-managed from the start. Israel and people in Gaza are just pawns in it. The control is held by the country, Qatar, that hosts and backs Hamas. That's why 5 months in, Hamas controls Rafah and returns to areas in Gaza, and there are 134 hostages in Gaza. End quote. You can call it a conspiracy theory, and it could be one, but let's not forget. Ultimately, everything is political and cynical.